Welcome everyone to Mornings with Planning, a webinar series hosted the first Wednesday of every month, where the Lexington Division of Planning discusses new ways to reconnect, reimagine, and respond in a new reality. These webinars will be held live and recorded for later viewing. My name is Lauren Weaver, GISP and Senior Planner with the Lexington Division of Planning, and I will be your moderator for today's November 4th, 2020 session. During this webinar, we will be discussing the shift to digital platforms with the onset of the pandemic, what advantages and disadvantages have been revealed, and how the public is able to engage in processes within our current environment. Public engagement is not a new conversation, but this discussion today is timely in many ways. Right now, we as a country are counting votes submitted by absentee ballots in unprecedented numbers due to the pandemic, and local governments across the world are leveraging, to a greater or lesser degree, new ways of connecting with their communities. Many feel divided into dangerous us and them categories, yet we continue to find ways to work together when things aren't working like they had before. So, kick back with your morning coffee or tea, and let's meet today's panelists. We have 4 panelists today, including Dennis Anderson, Anderson Communities founder, Ed Holmes, AICP and EHI Consultants principal and founder.
Morning.
Ginny Daley, neighborhood advocate and UK records manager, and Samantha Castro, AICP and lead for neighborhood development and Division of Planning long range senior planner. Panelists, thank you so much for joining us this morning. It's going to be a good conversation, and we have some good conversation topics lined up already. So we'll begin with a brief overview of your roles within Lexington. Let's start with Dennis. Dennis, maybe you can tell us a little bit about your experience in home renovation and construction and property management, as well as your work with commercial and mixed use development. And I really love your vision to build a better community.
We got started as like late night TV flipped this house, but if there's a lower priced home, we would keep it in our rental base and rent it. Almost half our community does not own a home, and they need good housing and they choose to rent. After years of doing that, in order to keep a workflow, to keep a talented workforce in place, I realized I had to get into something where I could get steady supply, and you couldn't do that in that market. So we moved into the development business. The first property we did was McConnell's Trace, and that worked out really good. I had a partner who was a developer, taught me development business. He was mostly concentrated on making money. We did one deal together, and then we went on to Townley Park. At Townley Park, we had a focus group with the employees. And we said that we'd made a little money and we're living comfortably, that we want to do something more important. And we decided we wanted to build a better community. So we ran down that road, and it was like herding chickens. We all had a different idea of what a better community was. So we focus group up again. We came up with our hierarchy of needs for a better community. And the foundation of it was clean, self, well maintained. And then, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, at the higher level was pride and esteem, health and fitness. And then the pinnacle of a better community is opportunities for social interaction. So we said we're going to go do a better development. That better development is a mixed use community. And so that's what we are now. That's what we try to do. In the time of social distancing, we still haven't forgot that we will be interacting with others soon, and we still see that as the pinnacle of a better community, is opportunities for interaction. That could be a walking trail, the deck of a swimming pool, a bar stool, a burger and a beer, someplace where you can meet your neighbor and control the contact time and be with them as little or as much as you want. And that's probably more than y'all wanted. So I'll say thank you for the opportunity to join you this morning.
Yeah, thank you for that background. Thank you. Ed, let's move on to you. You've done phenomenal work with public outreach in your projects with small area plans and routes, all with this backdrop of sustainable planning strategies. in both the public and private sector. Can you tell us a little bit about your work?
Yes, at EHI, we pride ourselves on what we consider some very basic tenets of planning, in public engagement, citizen involvement, sound, rational land use planning techniques built around engaging citizens. And a lot of times, citizens feel like they're not empowered, or they don't really get engaged or involved in the aspects of planning. And planning is more than just design. And the more difficult parts of planning that we've found is, how do you engage people to get involved in planning? And most of the time, this reactionary when a person or a group organization gets engaged in planning. So what we try and do is get them started early in the planning process. Tell them that what we're proposing to do. If we're doing a neighborhood plan, then we reach out to some of those community leaders, non-traditional groups that don't get engaged. So we like to call it a fun and interactive activity of getting people involved. And if we get them out and get them engaged, then we can get input from them. And now the challenge with this is you don't get the active engagement because of COVID. So now how do we, get them involved more on a, internet-based or some other type of platform where we can get people out. But, they're still interested. We just can't have groups. But we have done some other projects recently where the public has gotten engaged. So it's a challenge, but it's fun.
Yeah, I like that you say it's a challenge, but it's fun. That we have those options for exploring even right now. Thank you, Ed. Ginny, can you tell us a little bit about your background? I understand you're a librarian, but also a neighborhood advocate, which is largely what brings you here today.
Yeah, sure. I will say that my connection to Lexington is kind of odd. My family's from Lexington. My parents grew up and met here and got married. So my grandparents, lived here, and I always came here as a child several times a year and met up with cousins, whatnot. But I never really lived in Lexington until I went to college, moved here in the late 70s and stayed through the late 80s, and got both my degrees from UK, and then moved to North Carolina and lived there for about 20 some odd years, 25 years before coming back here. And I live when my grandmother died, I got her house because it was close to UK. It's at a very, very convenient location. And I saw how my grandmother lived in this little cottage, this little 1920s cottage, till she was in her 90s. And I thought, I'm very sentimental. I'm a historian and I do library and archives. So I came back to Kentucky in 2010, got a job at UK Facilities, and took over my granny's house with my newly minted historic preservation degree. So my house is my project studio, tearing apart my house, learning about it. But one of the things that I learned through my historic preservation degree was community engagement, and how preservation is very much a community activity and based on what the community wants or feels valuable to preserve. So when I moved back in 2010, 2011, boom, my neighborhood was in the middle of redevelopment. And so I kind of took what I had recently learned about civic engagement in terms of development and creating communities that are livable, walkable, modern, yet can still reflect the past, the identity of the community, saving all of that. So in the past 10 years that I've lived here, we've had, I think, 8 or 9 rezoning, redevelopment projects in my tiny little neighborhood. And we're talking about putting in apartment buildings next to little shotguns, or tearing down a row of shotguns to put in that apartment building. So that has really triggered my advocacy and involvement with the city planning department, with developers and whatnot.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that background. All right, last but certainly not least, Sam, can you talk about your work, both in the private sectors and now in the public sectors, in the government where you're working? And you've worked on small area plans and then more recently on the public engagement toolkit project as well. So you clearly have an interest in engaging people.
Yeah, I'm a little bit like Ginny too. I've probably been in Lexington for a little under 10 years. I'm from the Northeast originally, and then lived in Atlanta for 8 years prior to moving to Lexington. So I've kind of been around. Up until a little over a year ago, I've been on the private sector, working for architecture, planning, urban design firms. And I really loved that. I loved working on the private side of things, but I think what really interested me in moving into city government was actually I'd gotten to work on 3 of the small area plans with Ed and Stan Harvey at Lord X Sargent over time, and gotten to really get interested in this thought of engaging the public, of primarily equity concerns in underserved populations, and then also how I could leverage my my experience to bring more tenets of urban design and planning, mostly the design aspect of it, into the division of planning. I think that's what I'm really interested in, especially is like how to kind of talk that talk with the developers as they come in and bring us in rezoning and development plans, and be able to meet them at the table and speak their language. That's really interesting to me.
Thank you. Great. So audience, you have a better feel for our excellent panelists for today, and it's time to move into questions. So thank you to those who shared perspectives and submitted questions with your registration. That's always really helpful for preparing for this discussion. Audience members in attendance, feel encouraged to submit questions during the conversation using the Q&A functionality. And we have Valerie Friedman monitoring the Q&A and getting you the support that you need. So from the registration, we heard that you are generally liking the digital engagement options for ease of access, flexibility with schedules, and the ability to reach a wider range of our community. But there were concerns like navigating the challenges that are unique to virtual meeting technology, like system security, communicating engagement opportunities. It's always hard to get that word out, and connecting with community members without adequate internet or devices, which poses a unique challenge right now. And then always a challenge with our platforms, whether we're in person or separate, working in this 2D space that we have. It's always challenging to reach stakeholders. And that's something I think our panelists will be able to share some really great insight on. So let's start with a kickoff question. What kind of public engagement platforms have you each found yourselves using to engage in this 2D space that we're all sharing? And that could be a lot of different things. It could be Zoom or Cisco WebEx. It could be polling services or whiteboard technology. There are a lot of different things out there. So I'm just curious what each of you have found yourselves engaging with.
We do a lot of Zoom and a lot of team meetings. I like the fact that it saves time. You don't have to drive and park and walk. I miss the sidebars where you get to talk to someone, maybe say something or ask a question that you couldn't ask in front of everyone without alienating or there is a thing I've noticed about these meetings versus some of the other meetings is the dominant personality does not take over the meeting because they're not recruiting others. And it seems to give everybody a more equal voice. I like that. I hate to go to a meeting where one person just hijacks the whole meeting and takes over and talks over and doesn't let anybody have input. So, I miss the personal engagement. I like the fact that it's ease of getting to the meeting and talking. And I really appreciate the fact that one person doesn't seem to be able to take over the meeting.
Yeah, I'm sure all of the introverts appreciate that as well.
I do think as this evolves, the technology evolves, more and more the public will get more accustomed to using some of the technologies out there. I know we're learning to use some polling techniques now to get the public engaged, but I also see there are some limitations when we look at maybe neighborhoods or entities or organizations that don't have the access to technology or the availability to, you know, if you have a poor internet connection. And a lot of the neighborhoods we work in, there are some they don't have broadband, or they have the technology is limited, and even on your cell phones they can use it. But more recently we've done some projects. We're doing a project in Paris, Kentucky, and half the neighborhood just is not accessible or readily accessible. So there are some limitations. So I think as the technology evolves and becomes more accessible, it will become better. But I do think we're losing a segment of our communities because of the lack of availability or knowledge of technology. So when that occurs, then we find ourselves having to do some very focused stakeholder engagements on a very limited one-on-one or even telephone type of interviews. But technology is definitely beneficial. We don't have to travel as much now, but it does have some limitations. So we have to figure out how do we get over that digital divide, which still exists in some neighborhoods and communities.
Absolutely. And we can see in looking at different geographic breakdowns across Fayette County that does absolutely vary by neighborhood. Who has access to technology is not the full population. And in different areas of the city, we have larger chunks of the population with access. So thank you for bringing that up. That's a very important thing that we all need to be thinking about very seriously right now.
I think from the Division of Planning side, it's actually been it's been really, I would say, beneficial to us. You know, the kind of offshoot of COVID. You know, we had actually through the public engagement toolkit, and hopefully Valerie can put a link to that in the slides, and I can talk more about that later. But through the toolkit, you know, we really wanted to start pushing like, oh, we should have more engagement online, and how can we do that? How can we make our committee meetings more accessible to people? And then COVID hit, and we were, you know, just kind of forced to jump off that cliff. And you know, there are definitely still some equity concerns, like Ed's discussing, but I do think that uniquely we are actually reaching parts of the city and hearing from people that we have never heard from before. Just because, you know, if you're somebody that's working, you can't necessarily get down to City Hall, you know, in the middle of the afternoon on a Thursday, but you can have the meeting on in the background and, you know, perk up when it's the case that you're interested in to listen to. So we've been getting actually more people just kind of sitting and listening and being engaged in the process than ever before. And I'm hoping that, you know, when things, or if things return to normal, quote unquote, that we don't ever get rid of that functionality, that we still always reach out to people now on this platform as well as the in-person platform when that becomes an option again.
Sam, it's just like you to put more work on us for the benefit of the community. Ginny, I think I interrupted you. Please go ahead.
No. I would like to echo a lot of the sentiments that everybody said. I know for me personally, we've used professionally as a, you know, working at UK and in my as a librarian, we've already been using Zoom meetings and GoToMeetings and these kind of interfaces, and we're just doing it now more than ever. And like both Dennis and Sam have said, it's been so much easier for me, who has a full-time job, but then engages with planning on the side. It's been so much more accessible to do exactly like Sam says, to have a meeting going on in the background. And then when my case comes up, then I can get on. It saves time. I don't have to take off work. It's so much more accessible to me. But I will also notice in general that, so professionally, I'm comfortable with this kind of engagement and interaction. It feels fine to me. But like Ed was saying, there's a lot of people who are not comfortable with it. And I even have, I mean, I do happy hour with my girlfriends on Zoom and stuff like that. And even among that group, that small group, there are people who are very uncomfortable with using the technology for whatever reasons. Bad connections, don't trust the security, don't understand how to work it. I only have my phone, what am I doing? But librarians are used to, I will say in my profession, this sort of the digital divide, as you call it, we're used to that because you can't hold back for the lowest common denominator. You still have to move forward and take advantage of the technology, but you can't leave people behind. So there's a lot of ways that you can bridge that digital divide. And I mean, I hope moving forward, we are able to enter some sort of a hybrid situation that helps both people. But I think that you can have training sessions so people can become more comfortable with the technology. And right before COVID hit, one of the community groups that I'm involved in, the Fayette County Neighborhood Council, we were holding a series of tech workshops and mostly around city technology tools. And we had already done like how to navigate Building Eye, Acela, how to 311 and a complaint to the city, how to navigate the planning website, how to find certain things on the city's website. And that really was, those were sessions designed to make the general public feel more comfortable with the technology required to engage. We had a couple sessions coming up that COVID knocked out, and like how to navigate the PVA website and stuff like how to do Lex TV, watch archived videos of meetings. So I think that we can have either work with community groups or the city themselves do tech tool training sessions. And that's how you can bring people along. I mean, you can't get broadband in a neighborhood if it's not there yet. But I think if we are conscious of folks that may be disenfranchised by technical forward motion, if you're conscious of that, then you can develop the kinds of programs that programs or practices that need to include them. So I think, you know, like what Ed said, just being aware that this is happening, we can be more inclusive.
Yeah, thank you. That's well said. In that we do need to keep moving forward, but that doesn't mean we can leave people behind. If we leave people behind, that's really to the detriment of us all as well. You mentioned different tools like tech tools that were already available even pre-COVID. I just want to give a little additional shout out to that, and that we do have tools. If you're watching this and you didn't know, you can always call the planning division and get a better breakdown of it or a more deep breakdown of it. But we do have tools like Acela that let you access records for development plans. There are a lot of tools available on the website. Unfortunately, I hope I'm not delivering this news too badly, but it does look like Building Eye is not going to be continuing. Of course, the local government is under strain right now, as so many of us are, but this is a good time to maybe think about what public engagement influence we might have to keep technology delivering information to people in a way that is effective and helpful to facilitate public engagement. Okay, so we've talked about some different platforms that we've been using and some advantages and disadvantages that you found in these initial stages of expanding what we're using to access. And I'm hearing that the hybrid model may be a good one for the future. So you talked a little bit about being able to reach a wider segment of the population, even amidst the digital divide that is very prevalent. What does that look like? Who have you found you've been able to reach that you weren't necessarily able to reach before? And what does that look like? How are people engaging? And this is probably a good one for Sam, Dennis, and Ed, but of course, Ginny, please, I'm sure you have plenty to share as well.
Well, I think, given the technology capabilities, it does expand our opportunities to reach a wider audience. So, through the platforms that we have, it's really enhanced that. And you can reach a much wider audience, and you can do it on a much greater frequency. That's the thing that I find now. It's easier to have more meetings in a very confined space, but you can reach more people at a greater opportunity. So the frequency is enhanced as much as the other types of things. We don't find ourselves going to in-person meetings as much, but it's easier to schedule a Zoom meeting, and that's good and bad. Now you look at you may have 2 or 3 of those meetings scheduled, and it does reach the wider audience. But once again, it's that audience of those that are engaged and those that are involved and those that are interested. We still have to figure out how to reach those that are less engaged and less involved, and get them engaged as well.
Yes.
I think I'm going to use this as my opportunity to plug the public engagement toolkit before I forget. So this is a big undertaking that the Division of Planning has gone through for the past year now. It kind of stemmed out of the 2018 Comprehensive Plan, Imagine Lexington, which called for meaningful engagement from the development community prior to applying for a rezoning. And so then, of course, the question that planning kept getting was, what is meaningful engagement? What are you guys talking about? And so as we started to try to answer that question, we realized that this toolkit that we were creating really needed to be twofold. It needed to answer the question for developers, but it also needed to help the public and the community understand where they fit into the process and how they could get involved. So through the toolkit, we tried to create a very user-friendly version, but that really goes through a step-by-step of how to get information out, how to notify people that you're planning a meeting, how to hold a meeting, and then how to follow up afterwards. It put stuff back on the division of things that we could be doing better to get out there. So that's everything from, I don't know if some of you might have seen the development snapshots that we're using that are kind of a simple one-pager that we've been using on the latest kind of rezoning cases that just should be a really simple, easy way to get across the high points of a new zoning case that's coming through. And if you want to know more, you go into Excella. But I think that those, the title of this webinar, I think, said something about a multi-pronged approach. And I think that is what's been really important, is that not everyone receives information the same way. Some people like to get a letter in the mail. Some people like to get an email or see it on Facebook, or, see a notification sign in a front yard. Like, there's so many ways that you have to get out there and try and reach people. I know even for this webinar, we sent it out a million different ways, and each time we would get 10 new registrations from a different medium that we were using. So I think that's a big takeaway, is just try and get the word out in as many ways as possible.
That's great, Sam. It is a great toolkit. And I just wanted to mention real quick that link for the toolkit is in the chat. So if anybody's interested, you can go to the chat and click on that. Dennis, please go ahead.
I'll give a little case study. The Baptist Church on Todd's Road, we'd had their zone hearing the same night they had theirs. And theirs was prior to mine. I really never looked at the property, wasn't that knowledgeable of it, but sitting through the hearing, it's apparent that they hadn't met with the neighbors and hadn't included them, and they got defeated. So the next day I called the minister and I said, I realize y'all been through a difficult, trying situation. It's very stressful and you're disappointed, but would you be willing to try it again? I think I can see a way to get this through. So at that point, it was a spoken word, not a text or a written word. Because so many times a text or written word has a rough edge or a connotation that's not what you intended. So I like the spoken word. And this was a telephone call, and then it was a meeting. And then he met with these congregation and said, this gentleman says he thinks he sees where we erred. He would like a chance to take it. And are you all prepared to go through this again? And so they said yes. And then from there, I'd heard the neighbors' chief complaints. I'd heard the staff's chief complaints. I think I came down next to meet with the staff and said, if I can get this, this, and this, does that get you to yes? And they seemed receptive, even though they did suggest against it. Once we got to the end, we weren't able to get them everything they wanted. I'd already had a relationship with the people at Todd, so I called the president over there and I said, Irv, y'all oppose this development next door. It's going to be developed. Would you support me if I take a chance on this? And, it's just a matter of who's going to develop. It's going to be developed. The fact that you constantly beating back is not a reality. And he said they were willing to talk about it. So we had meetings and found out what was most important to them. And let me say here, the real deal is don't show up with any predetermined notions, ask questions and listen real carefully and see what the 1 or 2 deal breakers for them are. And so the church had 1 or 2 deal breakers. The staff had 1 or 2 deal breakers, maybe even more. The Andover villas had their deal breaker. They didn't want the road going beside them. They wanted a landscape buffer. And then the Andover Woods, I'd never worked with them. So I called the president and talked to her, and we had several conversations. And then I went to the neighborhood and talked to a few of the influencers and walked the property with them and got their concerns. And we gave everybody a little bit of what they wanted. Nobody got everything they wanted. And we were able to get the deal done. But I found it was mostly written word, personal meetings. We did have a Zoom meeting with the Andover Forest. Well, we had Zoom meetings with all the groups, but we had a Zoom meeting with Andover Forest, who I'd never had an interaction with prior to this. And we had 20 neighbors show up and speak. And so there's pretty good input. I don't think we would have gotten that input anywhere. And the few people who normally hijack the meeting just got frustrated and checked out. So everybody could talk and get meaningful conversation and get through the emotions, the feelings, and get to what really mattered. And we were able to get everybody their most important things, and we're successful with the zoning.
That's a nice example of how we can all have very different interests and divide into different categories of, for example, staff versus developer, or neighborhood versus applicant, and so on and so on and so on. But how when we come together with tools and an interest in moving something forward and have open minds and can communicate effectively using tools like the public engagement toolkit, we can really get a better result for our community. So thank you for sharing that example.
I think the key to it was meeting with individuals and getting a little lay of the land, and the groups that were like-minded, meeting with them individually, so things didn't fall apart before we got started, and find out what really mattered to them and trying to get that.
Yeah, I think if you can have those individual one-on-one type of meetings, you can reach a lot more consensus and better way to do it. When you bring everyone together in a large group setting, like Dennis said, the more vocal ones tend to take control of those types of meetings. So we find when we do stakeholder engagements, if we can get a smaller group or one-on-one type of interaction or discussion, we can reach a lot more consensus.
I just want to say, I just want to point out that Dennis's example really points to the fact that public engagement is work, and it's hard work, and it's work on everyone's part. Both all of us, Dennis, myself, and Ed, were on an advisory board for the public engagement toolkit. And I think when we first started, we were with a bunch of other people too. It was a very large advisory group, very large and diverse. But I think as diverse as this group was, I think we all kind of went in with the notion that we were gonna figure out a recipe for public engagement. And we quickly found out, as Sam pointed out, there's not one way to engage. There's multiple ways to engage. There's a lot of different ways for a lot of different situations, different neighborhoods, different development types, different funding types. All of this means that, you know, if you have one recipe that you know is going to work, it makes life so much easier. And what we found out is there's not one recipe. You have to figure it out, and it requires a lot of work. And I just want to point out, not to harp on this, but as a citizen, for citizens to engage, a lot of times they're engaging on top of the rest of their life. Whereas whether you work in this for the city as a planner, or if you've been hired, you know, to do a small area plan, or if you're a developer, that's your gig. That is your day gig. And when neighborhoods or citizens, individual citizens engage, it's on top of whatever their other gig is too. So not only do they have to pony up the time, they have to think strategically and have to learn a lot of things that are just not part of their normal discourse, things about how to read a blueprint, understanding zoning and what a zone change might mean in their area. So public engagement is good. And as Lauren pointed out, if you do commit the time to engage, you can end up with a better product. But eyes wide open, it takes a lot of work on everybody's part.
Yeah, it's not a one size fits all in public management. And I think you have to do an assessment of who your audience is that you're trying to reach and who the people that are going to be affected. And then you tailor engagement tool around that. You just can't have one straitjacket of options, and it really depends on who you're talking to and what the impact or what the development or what you're doing.
And it doesn't always work, so you got to keep trying and honing and learning. Oh, this didn't work, let's try something else. And so it's a long game. It's not a short game.
Those are great points. I often find myself reflecting on like diverse perspectives, and I start thinking about like thumbprints and how we each have unique thumbprints, supposedly. I don't know if I totally buy that, but I also think it seems to be relatively factual. And so if we have different thumbprints, then how much more complex are our brains? And then when we combine our brains and our interests and our environments, we're complex beings with complex interests that matter. So coming together is so important, and having that dialogue in whatever format it takes. Sam, one of the things I really admired about the advisory group that worked on the public engagement toolkit is how diverse the perspectives of the people involved really were. And I know that's something you intentionally tried to do. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what guided your selection of those different perspectives, and then how you helped to bridge the gaps. I remember when I sat in on some of the advisory group meetings, and when they first came in, there was a lot of maybe tension is the right word, of like, oh, well, what are they thinking? Like, what are they going to do? And then at the end, everybody was like pals and had come together to put together this really incredible toolkit to benefit our entire community. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure, I'd love to. It's actually kind of funny because one of the first kind of aha moments that we had as the advisory group was that in very kind of contentious group settings, the best tool that you have is to have a facilitator. And so in this case, I really just acted as the facilitator. The toolkit was all of the ideas of the group, and we were just, as the division, authoring it for the group. And it was made up of around 20 people from every range of community member and professional that we could think of. So we had, you know, some folks from the development community, real estate attorneys. We also went to the opposite extreme and picked some community members like Ginny, who'd been in it for a long time, or Carrie Churchill, who was just kind of enthusiastically getting into the process of figuring out what planning was all about, and making sure that the toolkit read on all those things. So making sure we weren't, you know, kind of being too parochial for a developer or planner that had been doing this for a long time, but still kind of really getting at the fact that, you know, I feel like in the division we have a lot of developers that come into us and say like, hey, I have this application I want to file, and we ask them, have you engaged the community? And they say, no, not yet, but we'll have a meeting with them, which isn't enough. Like, as to Dennis's point, like, you need to do the work before you even come to us with the application. And, you know, it's starting to become very clear when they haven't done the work. And now the Planning Commission, through the toolkit, has discovered, like, you know, they know the question to ask now. They know that they need to be asking these developers, well, like, well, how much have you engaged with the community? And was that only like 3 or 4 people that you talked to, or was it more than that? When you say you talk to the whole neighborhood, who is the whole neighborhood? Excuse me. So I think that's been, you know, a really interesting aspect to it. But I mean, this was probably, I've been doing engagement for, you know, 15 years now, and this was probably one of the best groups I have ever worked with in terms of their level of involvement and dedication. And, you know, once a month they would come together and they would have these conversations. I would set up an agenda and it would go completely off the rails because they'd start talking about God only knows what. But we came up with what I think is a really good product in the end that everyone seems to be proud of. So yeah, check it out if you haven't looked it up yet. But I think we're all really proud of what came of that.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, so let's keep chugging forward. Man, time always goes so quickly. I feel like we could talk for 3 hours and not have enough time to talk about all of the things that we would like to discuss. So we've talked quite a bit about this already, but I'll go here and see if there's anything else you guys would like to add. So I think this would be a good one for perhaps Ed and Ginny, but again, if you guys would like to weigh in, feel free. We all have good perspectives here. So as we've discussed, in some ways, moving meetings to a digital platform has brought new participants to the conversation, but there are still so many hurdles from the digital divide and the variety of perspectives in our neighborhood. So for example, or in our neighborhoods. So like, in the urban service area, 55% of the population are renters, but renters don't necessarily have representation in meetings in the same way. And about 27% of Fayette County's population is comprised of diverse racial groups, which are really important. So how can we make our meetings, public hearings, and input outreach more equitable for everyone in the community, whether it's diverse housing situations, racial heritage, age groups, and so on and so on and so on? There's really no limit to the amount of differences we have. It's coming together that matters. So maybe you guys can suggest some tactics to help people feel more included and want to come and talk.
Well, I think in part, it depends on the issues is what ultimately going to get the groups that feel like they're disenfranchised or are left out. It's going to be the issue that gets them engaged or get them involved. You know, there's always the issues of gentrification and the effects that's going to have on neighborhoods. And when people are being moved out or displaced, and that tends to get a resident's interest. And so what we found now as we work through neighborhoods, if it has a direct impact on that group or that individual, then it will definitely get them more involved and more engaged. Whether it's a zone change that's coming into their neighborhood that they're opposed to, then and no one had reached out to them initially. The old building in the east end of Lexington that was slated to be torn down, the Palmer building on 5th and Chestnut Street, that's got the neighborhood to coalesce around that issue. So it really depends on what's happening to them at that point. If they're not directly impacted, then they're just not engaged or they're just not interested. And we try and get them engaged in the planning process. And they've started to learn more about planning. The East End's a good example of that. They're always on planning about what have you done in terms of implementing some of the recommendations of the East End plan. And so they've bought into it. So you got some champions and neighborhood advocates that come along and really get involved, and others, unless it directly impacts or affects them, it's difficult to get them involved.
And I have to give a big shout out to Ed, having worked on the small area plans with them. You know, I'd done engagement in a lot of ways, but like Ed and Ryan over at EHI, like they come up with these things. Like he had a health fair in Winburn that got all these folks out. In Cardinal Valley, they literally went door to door along Alexandria to get, you know, all those, you know, there are a lot of Spanish speaking business owners there. So we did bilingual handouts that they gave out. They did, I think you guys did like some sort of Parks and Rec fair in, for Armstrong Mill. So just changing it up all the time and watching Ed do that has been really cool in ways to like low tech ways to get people involved that I think is really unique.
Right. I know. And one we did, I think we gave out bicycle helmets. We wanted to get the kids involved and get them engaged. We talked to them on the safety of cycling and bicycling, and they came out. We gave them, I think it was granola bars. They didn't go for that too much, but the bicycle helmets was a big hit. Granola, not so big.
That's kind of a surprise to me. I would think the kids would be more interested in granola than the helmets. I think that speaks well to the future of our communities if the kids are more interested in keeping their brain safe than getting a snack.
I think I just wanted to weigh in. I think Ed nailed it. I think in order that there has to be a crux of motivation for anybody to engage. And I think it started with me when I first moved back here. I was immediately confronted with a redevelopment project that involved a land swap with a pocket park that we have in the neighborhood. And so it was immediate for me. And from that, I've learned that what goes on in my neighborhood and how it reflects in a bigger picture. You have to start, I think, with something that hits home with people, and then can educate them into the larger, what's good for Lexington at large, what's good for me in my neighborhood, what's good for my neighborhood, what's good for my area, what's good for Lexington at large, thinking bigger, but it starts with that real personal motivation. And kind of on the flip side of that, I would like to say that I don't think Lexington is very good at engaging its citizenry in the aspects of local government. And this is not necessarily true for planning, which does a lot of outreach. But in general, the change is really made at the board, commission, those type levels. And the citizens that are usually engaged on those boards and commissions and committees and whatnot are people who can afford the time to participate in those. And that right there knocks out a whole class of people. It's basically a kind of elite that has the time to give to that. So I think Lexington can do better, try to engage average citizens on a lot of boards and commissions instead of people that are just already in those professions. Would like to see more of that, more citizen advisory committees, more citizen ombuds position. I think we've had that in the past and lost it. So I think Lexington can do better. I think planning is a good model for how to start that, and has done well. But overall, the city needs to do better, I think.
So Ginny,
Ginny,
that leads. Oh,
I was going to
Go
say,
ahead,
I think that's
please.
a great, I want to give a little shout out to Civic Lex. I know that, you know, Richard Young sat on our advisory group for this, and I know that they are really trying to make some big inroads. They're kind of starting almost like an adult civics, you know, series of classes on how to get engaged better in our local government, not just planning, but our government as a whole. So I would encourage you all to sign up for their weekly newsletter too, just because I think that that's, you know, that's how we find out about that stuff. I wasn't very good at Civics 101, so this is all good for me too.
Yeah. Valerie's dropping loads of helpful links into the chat. So if you have not checked that out yet, we're in like the last segment. So I would encourage you to click them all and open them up so you have them for after the webinar. So we've been talking about a lot of really important things. We've been discussing like what is a stakeholder and the different forms that that can take and how to reach different stakeholder groups and meet them where they're at, whether they're working 9 to 5 or they're balancing a heavy workload or they don't have access to internet or they just don't have any time. Their perspectives still matter, and the development that happens and the government decisions that happen affect their daily lives. So really striving to involve them is super important. I think this really leads well into the next question here, and that citizens expect to be heard. Over the past months on a national and even a global scale, I would say, we've seen how people find mechanisms to affect change. We've seen protests, we've seen private websites with reviews, we've seen all kinds of different mechanisms that people are using to be heard and to influence their reality. So the question I have for anyone that is interested in answering it would be like, what responsibility do you feel that government bodies like Planning Commission and Council and staff public servants have to address the concerns and provide avenues for safe public engagement, even in a pandemic? Because the protests are not, they're important, but we're together in protests and we're in a pandemic and the rates keep going up. So what can government do? What responsibilities do we have?
Boy, I don't know. Nothing really profound comes to mind, but I do want to say that a lot of the public engagement sessions that I've been in, that I've participated in, and you know, we haven't talked much about the Mayor's Commission on Racial Equity and Justice. It had a subcommittee on housing and gentrification, and it kind of segued on the work that the Neighborhoods and Transition Task Force has been doing. And the Neighborhoods and Transition Task Force held a couple public forums and had some public comment time at their regular meetings. And what I heard in those meetings, I think the organizers of the meetings are trying to identify problems and come up with solutions. But what I hear from the public is so much pain. And even in what happened in my neighborhood, we've had two developers who engaged the neighborhood. And those meetings were a train wreck because people are just, they're starved for someone to listen to what their voice, and they're just purging. They're purging all this pain and laying it down because, oh my, that's the only public engagement that they have. And, you know, like in the Neighborhoods in Transition Task Force, talking about clear steps the city can take, and then public comment will talk about reparations. You know, there's just, reparations is not a solution to gentrification. It's a core understanding that would help people, but there's just pain coming out, and there has to be, I think, a way to let people engage more so they can get this pain out and start talking constructively. Like, I hear your pain, but what can we do? What can this group do to help out, to get things into action? But there's still a lot of pain in Lexington. And I don't know, I think unless you bleed that out, and you can't really start moving towards constructive work until you address that pain.
Ginny, I really appreciate that you mentioned the recent report from the Mayor's Commission for Racial Justice and Equality. That was it was many subcommittees working together that then created this larger commission report that went to the mayor. And I think right now it's in the mayor's hands to decide what to do with it. So this could be a critical moment even to reach out to people and say, these are important things in here. I'd also add, Valerie, you're killing it with these links. She put a link to that commission into the chat, and I would encourage you guys to read that report, or if you don't want to sit down and read the 60th pages, Civic Lex also put together a briefer guidance. It's like you read my mind. that was beautiful. So it's really an important time, and I admire the mayor's approach in assembling that commission and encouraging that dialogue and requesting that report. So I think it does say that we have a government that wants to listen and wants to do the right thing, and now it's a matter of what we do with it. We're right at the end already. So if anybody has any burning things they'd like to get out on that question, please go ahead, or I will go ahead and move on to the final questions. Okay, great. So to wrap it up, maybe in just a few sentences or so, you guys can talk about what a return to normal might look like when we make it through this, which we will make it through this. What is it going to look like when we come out on the other side? And do you have any advice to those navigating the challenges right now that maybe don't have access to the technology or comfort with the technology? I'm still trying to get my dad to do a Zoom call with me. So those are a lot of things to ask for a simple response, but I would love to hear from each of you on that as we close out.
I hope that it's a new normal, that we don't go back to the way we were doing things, that, like I said, we incorporate face-to-face and digital, but I hope that in the future we can go out and reach those neighborhoods that and those citizens that don't have access to technology, and maybe bring them into a senior center or a church, and they can all get in on a Zoom call together if that's what interests them. Or like Ginny was saying, FCNC could maybe help to host things about like how do I now navigate this digital world from home. So I hope it's just a new normal.
Agree. Hybrid. I think we've learned some new things, but we've also learned that we can't leave other things behind. Hybrid. It's got to be hybrid.
I heard a lady speak about attending a TRC technical review committee. This is where the engineers and planners get together and they really get into the details of a plan, pick it apart. And they were totally enthralled and enthused and learned so much through that. I think this will still give people that, where people never went to a TRC, the public never went to a TRC meeting. I didn't attend most of them. I sent an engineer. And so they got the chance to see it and they got an understanding. And the more people understand about things, the less they fear it. And the more transparency, the more engagement, and they don't feel like something's happened, they've been hoodwinked or anything. It'll teach them things about connectivity and sidewalks and trails and stormwater retention versus detention, and it'll just give them a whole lot better understanding. The mind that doesn't know fills in the blanks with what they fear most. Mm-hmm. And so I think it'll make things better in the long run.
Yeah, I think the more citizen planners we can create, what you're doing, what planning and the community's doing, creating opportunities through the public engagement toolkit, what you've done at Imagine Lexington, and planning has always been very forceful in engaging the public. When we did our plans here in the community, no matter what it is, they've always stressed strong citizen participation. So I do feel the more citizen planners we create, the better this community will become. And you can do that through a combination of, once we get back to whatever normal is going to be, it'll be a combination of utilization of technology and some limited outreach in face-to-face or person-to-person. But when we combine those two together, I think we'll create a much broader coalition of people that we can work with and more avenues from which to reach out to them.
That's really well said. Valerie, I don't know if you're able to track down a link to the Citizens Planning Academy, I think is the title from Fayette Alliance, but I think that's a really nice offering. And the planning division also offers trainings on things as well. And I think that's absolutely accurate, that having more citizen planners and more people in our community that are engaged in planning processes and government processes can lead to a better community for all of us. So this is the end. We're going to go a couple minutes over with this wrap up spiel, but it's been a really great conversation, guys. Audience members, if you have any questions that we didn't discuss today, please consider reaching out to the panelists or the Division of Planning or whatever entity in your local government that you're interested in. There are ways to engage. So think about what you care about and think about how you can engage and how you can help improve the world that we all share and live in. We heard a lot of really great things today. And at the end, Dennis, just a few minutes ago, was talking about moving away from fear, which is absolutely a corruptive mentality. I think the more that we move away from this us versus them mentality and start thinking more about we, the better off that we will all be. And it's okay if we don't always see things the same and don't always agree. We can find a path forward. We talked about better outreach to groups that don't normally engage in processes and what those different stakeholders can look like and how important it can be to get in touch with those groups by perhaps non-traditional ways that are more effective, because if they're not working, then they're probably not a good way. How can we bridge this digital divide that's exacerbated by this pandemic that we're living in, whether it's getting technology to people or going out of the way to use the technology that they have, like phones, for example. And something that I really appreciate about the push to technology, I'm a technology person. I like tech a lot. And I do really admire the way that people have been willing to leverage the technology to reach a wider audience, like you were talking about, with greater frequency and more of this 2D like space that we have. I think our Zoom meeting caps are like 100 or 200 people or something compared to like the 20 people you can fit cramped into a room for a technical review committee. So I'd like to express gratitude to our panelists for your contributions today. It's been really great. Dennis, Ed, Ginny, Sam. Our coordinator for this was our Sam Castro here. So thank you so much for putting together this stellar panel. Valerie Friedman on the back end did a phenomenal job with Q&A support. This is probably your last chance to click all those links, folks, so do it now. And then technical support was offered by Stephanie Cunningham. And then perhaps most importantly, thank you to our audience for being interested in engaging with us in this way. This is a way that we hadn't explored before the pandemic. So this very webinar series and your presence here today is important. The Mornings with Planning webinar series will continue to discuss new ways to reconnect, reimagine, and respond in a new reality. And we want to hear from you. What topics should we discuss as we move Lexington forward together? You can email us at imagine@lexingtonky.gov. Let us know. We will be back on the first Wednesday of next month, December 2nd, so our last one for 2020, where we will be joined by planners from Lexington, Tallahassee, Detroit, and Raleigh, North Carolina. So we've got a national audience now to discuss topics and trends in planning throughout the US as we look to 2021. For more information on future sessions, to access the recording from this webinar, and to learn more about planning in Lexington, visit imaginelexington.com or lexingtonky.gov/planning and follow us on social media. Thank you for spending your morning with us, and we'll see you next time.